So yes, last week we spoke about divine providence in miracles, and I promise you this week we talk about divine providence in matchmaking, finding the right partner.
Oh.
So the Gemara says that when Rish Lakish would begin a discussion, beginning a certain tractate of Talmud, he would teach the lesson of Ein Mizavkin Le'Adam Isha El Lefi Ma'asav. A person merits a wife, a spouse, according to his deeds. Shenemar, as the verse states, Ki lo yanuach shevet harasha al gerel hatzadikim. The rod of the wicked does not fall into the portion of the righteous. So a person gets a wife according to his own actions. If he's deserving, he gets a good wife. If he's undeserving, he gets a less desirable spouse. So the Gemara says, Amar Barchana, Amar V'yechanan, and this is how it goes into this week's Parsha, V'kashan l'zavgon k'kriyas yamsuf. Matchmaking for God is just as difficult as splitting the sea. As the pasuk says, Elikim Moshe v'chidim b'isa, God takes individuals and puts them together, he marries them. Interestingly enough, Motzi asirim b'kosharis. He takes singles out of prison into prosperity. So unlike today, the common trope of marriage is that you're going into prison. To God, it's the opposite. Life as a bachelor or bachelorette is the prison, and getting married is the exodus into prosperity. Okay, so how do we see the splitting of the sea there? So there's two explanations. The Talmud and Sotah seems to indicate that the explanation is that the idea is that you left prison and entered prosperity, which is sort of what marriage is and what happened when we left Egypt. We left Mitzrayim, we left prison, we entered prosperity, and that happened through the splitting of the sea. However, Talmud and Sanhedrin, as well as in Vayikra Rabbah and Medrash, there's a different hint there. The illusion is that the word for prosperity is b'kosharos. B'kosharos means prosperity, but it could also be read as b'chi shiros, with cry, with tears, and with singing. And when the Jewish people were walked through the dry land in the middle of the split sea, so there were obviously the Egyptians who were presumably crying on their way to their deaths, and the Jewish people who sang rewards. So too, when God puts together individuals, there is sometimes a pain or a difficulty in that happening. And we'll have to explain this. So the Talmud has a question. Questions the Talmud, it is known that 40 days before a fetus is born, God chooses who their spouse will be. Now, hold on a second. A fetus has no deeds at all. There's no righteous and there's no wicked fetus. They're both equal. Fetus hasn't done anything in life. So why would it be challenging for God to choose spouses for fetuses? What's the difficulty there? And also, how can you say it's depending on their actions? There is no actions. So the Gemara says the answer is kan bizug rishon, kan bizug sheni. Depends if it's the first pair or the second pair. Well, what does that mean? What does the first pair and the second pair mean? So if it's the first pair, that's easy. That's like 40 days before a fetus is born. God decides who they're going to marry. If it's the second pair, then it depends on their deeds. Now, what does that mean? What does first and second pair mean? So there's a little bit of a debate. The simple explanation is the first pair means a person's first marriage, and the second pair is a person's second marriage. So to speak, God chooses a soulmate for a person, and if he needs to remarry, that could be sometimes because it's his own fault, sometimes it's not necessarily his fault. Once he's remarrying, then the spouse he gets is according to his deeds. And God chooses him an appropriate spouse. There's another explanation that's given. We find that a court of men judges individuals at the age that they're of maturity. Maturity in halacha is 13 years old for a male, 12 years for a female, basically puberty. However, the heavenly court gives you some extra time to work it out. God doesn't judge a person until 20 years old. So the youthful indiscretion a person has in his teenage years, God will, to some extent, ignores. The heavenly court mainly rules on a person's actions once they're 20 years old. So another one of the Tosfos explains, the first pair is when you get married before you're 20 years old. person gets married before he's 20 years old, so then he isn't owed a heavenly judgment, and he gets married to the spouse that God chose for him 40 days before he was born. However, if he's getting married after 20 years old, then God chooses somebody for him that is according to his own actions. And we'll soon see, perhaps there's a third explanation of what the first and the second pair means. But there are a number of difficulties in the comparison between marriage and splitting of the sea. At the simplest level, marriage is taking two people and making them one people, one unit, one couple. However, on the flip side, splitting the sea is the opposite. You took one ocean and you split it into two. Sort of the opposite comparison. Additionally, we're saying here that a marriage of a person's actions, when God chooses a spouse for a person based on his actions, that's compared to splitting the sea. That's the difficult spouse, the spouse that God has to, so to speak. It's more difficult for God to find. Not that there's any difficulty in front of God, but that the easier version would be the version of 40 days before a person's born. However, there's an interesting dialogue that went on when God split the sea. He told Moshe, "Stretch out your hand." So Medrash says there was another dialogue that happened that's not printed in the text. What happened? Moshe said, "Hold on a second. You've commanded that the coast is the boundary of the dry land. So how can you tell me to split the sea when you've already said that you won't be splitting seas, basically? What you'll be doing is the coast will serve as the border of the dry land. How can you split the sea in the middle? That's not the coast." So God says to him, "Hold on, don't worry about it. If you read the first passage in the Torah, when God creates, so he separates the dry land from the waters on the second day of creation, God makes a commitment from the oceans. And the commitment is that when it's going to be time for the Jewish people to cross through the sea, you're going to have to split. So therefore, it doesn't contradict my commitment. My commitment is that the dry land will be the border of the sea. The coast will be the border of the sea. But their creation has a predetermined commitment that at some point in time it has to split. Sort of a condition in the creation of the oceans itself, in the separation of the dry land and the water. And because this commitment predates its creation, therefore I'm exempt from this requirement, and you can go ahead and split the ocean. Now, I'll ask you a question. Hold on a second. What exactly does this sound like? It sounds like the miracle of the ocean, of splitting the sea, was actually a predetermined miracle. It sounds a lot more like the miracle that God basically takes a child before it's born and says, "This is going to be your spouse." It doesn't sound like it's a scenario that happens, depending on a person's acts of righteousness or the other way. So therefore, it seems that the comparison is further difficult. Why is it that we're comparing God choosing a spouse to a person who is, according to his actions, he's already, maybe it's a second marriage, maybe he's older than 20 years old. We're comparing that to the splitting of the sea, when really the splitting of the sea should actually be compared to the other type of marriage, the marriage of a person who God chooses their soulmate before they're born. You heard the question? What? No. The question is that the Medrash is saying that the Medrash is saying that the splitting of the sea was a predetermined miracle. It was a miracle that happened before the ocean was created. So in a certain sense, it wasn't even a miracle, really. It was sort of a condition in the creation of the oceans. And we're comparing, so that would sound a lot like a person before he's born, where God says, "This is going to be your spouse." It doesn't sound like a person who's already, married, or he's looking to remarry, and God looks at and evaluates, what type of wife is he worthy of? Together now?
Are there any other preconditioned miracles?
Yes, quite a few.
Just like all the miracles at a creation that we read about. I'm trying to think of some examples. There's a whole bunch of things that were built in the.
Very good. There were 7 specific miracles that are cited in Masechtas Avos, and there are a few more. So, for example, the pit that swallowed Korach, the mun that rained down in the desert, the Moshe Rabbeinu's staff. What else? I can't remember all of them. But there are a few of them. There are a few of them, and we'll explore that in more detail. We'll get to it in a moment. Now, to go a little bit further into this analogy of God's matchmaking is similar to splitting the sea. There's an interesting conversation that the Medrash Rabbah tells took place. There was a noble woman, very wealthy, privileged woman, and she met the rabbi Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rav Tachlafta. So she turns to Rabbi Yossi and she says, "I have a simple question." Like the privileged guy that meets the academic. He asks him the question. This question has been bothering me my whole life. What's the question? The question is, how long did it take for God to create the world? He says 6 days, because the Pasuk says God created the world in 6 days. She says, "Okay, this is my question. Till then, from then until now, what's he doing? How does he keep himself busy?" Now, this is not exactly a legitimate question for an infinite God, but obviously, Rav Yossi wasn't necessarily going to answer her that. So Rav Yossi says he's making shidduchim, he's matchmaking, he's helping people find their spouses and their businesses and houses as well. So she says, matchmaking, that's such a big deal. I could do it too. So she's a privileged woman, she's a noble woman, she has plenty of slaves, she summons 1,000 male slaves and then 1,000 female slaves, and she lines them up, and in one night she makes 1,000 partnerships, 1,000 marriages. The next day, one guy comes back with a broken bone, the other guy's scratched in his face, another guy's limping, and everybody has complaints. That happened, and nobody's happy with the marriages. So she was a little embarrassed. She calls back Rav Yossi, and she sees the futility of her idea, and she acknowledges, you were right. It's something that's worthy of difficulty, at least that. So Rav Yossi says you should know that for God it's considered equally difficult as splitting the sea. And he brings this verse that we saw, that matchmaking often involves singing and crying, and that this is the challenge of God when he's looking to find people, make marriages, find spouses. The difficulty is finding people that are correctly suited for each other. And the reason, like we explained in the Gemara, is because the difficult marriages are the ones that are, either second marriages or over the age of 20 marriages. So these are marriages that are made each person according to his merit. And that's a challenge. Okay. So now I want to address these questions. But first, before we address the questions, try to examine a little bit more the specifics of the miracle of splitting of the sea. And miracles in general. We spoke last week about divine providence. And we'll try to continue a little bit this week talking about miracles on a more philosophical level. Now, if you look throughout Talmud, throughout the rabbinic literature, an example of the difficult, if somebody's looking for a star miracle, it's usually splitting of the sea. That's like the poster child for God doing miracles. Like, what's the biggest miracle of God? That he split the sea. When we read the Haggadah on Pesach, on Passover, we read that God performed during the splitting of the sea 5 times as many miracles as he performed during the Exodus, the 10 plagues in Egypt. So this looks like the poster child of the miracle, like capital T with the trademark at the end. The miracle is splitting of this. Yet the Medrash says the miracle of the Exodus is greater. Why is that? So we, every Shacharis we daven, we say Kriya Shema, and after Kriya Shema and Shacharis we say V'yatzav v'nochan, and there we mention Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus, and we also mention Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea. Now, let's say you were davening very quickly and you skipped the line on Kriyas Yamsuf, splitting the sea. What's the law? Continue davening. Shouldn't do it, but if it's a mistake, it's okay, move on. But if you forgot to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus, you have to repeat that segment of the prayer. It's before Shema Esrei, between Kriya Shema and Shema Esrei. So evidently we see here that the miracle of the Exodus is a bigger miracle. Not only that, the verse states in Devarim, Deuteronomy, God speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu and he says to him, he says, has it ever occurred that a nation was redeemed from oppression with miracles, with wonders, for everybody to see, for all of these were open miracles forever, has never happened before. So in other words, God, so to speak, testifies about his greatness by bringing the example of the Exodus, 10 plagues in Egypt, and ultimately the Exodus in Egypt. So we see here from the Medrash that in certain ways, the miracle of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus, is greater than the miracle of Bris Yamsuf, splitting the sea. And obviously the question is, hold on, which one's greater? Why is it that the poster child for God's miracles is so often splitting the sea? And now with Medrash, it seems to tell us that no, Yetzias Mitzrayim was a bigger miracle. So obviously, what's the answer? Depends on what we mean by bigger miracle. Right? Depends on what we mean. What does it mean, a big miracle? So now let's explore the ideas of miracles. There's two interesting thoughts about miracles that I think are important to consider. And I think this will explain how each miracle is bigger in a certain way, greater. The Rambam teaches that there are two types of miracles. There are the quote unquote natural miracles. What's a natural miracle? These are miracles that were built into creation. These are miracles like the pit that swallowed Korach, miracles like the mun, the food that supported the Jewish people in the deserts, miracles like Kriyas Yamsuf, splitting the sea. These are natural miracles. What do I mean by natural? Meaning that when God created nature, he also created the moment that nature would accommodate what he wanted. There's another class of miracles that the Rambam talks about in Moreh Nevuchim, which I'm going to call interventionist miracles. These are miracles that weren't built into the nature of the world when God created the world, but this is where God abruptly changes something and then switches it back. So what's an example of such a miracle? Yetzias Mitzrayim. Yetzias Mitzrayim is a very good example of such a miracle, because although it could be the case, perhaps, that the Jewish people would have been in Mitzrayim, it is not the case that the Egyptians would have been punished. That is eminently clear in the sources. The Egyptians were punished because of their own volition, because they decided to oppress the Jewish people. So God intervened, and he brought a bunch of wild animals to kill them. He brought darkness for a couple of days. God intervened in nature in a non-pre-planned event. This wasn't like God created all the animals and told them, before I create all of you, at some time, some week in 2,400 years ago, you're going to have to run into Egypt and wreak havoc. It was not what happened. God created the animals. And then at some point, God summoned all the animals and put them into Egypt and had them kill people for a week. Not just kill people, but, just wreak havoc, basically. Ruin things. What does that mean? So that's a fundamental question. That's a more fundamental question. Well, how could it be that punishment can ever happen? That's really the question of Yediyah and Bechira.
Hashem created something. He knew what that.
No, we mean right. When I mean creation here, I mean the creation not of the animals, but the creation of animal as an entity, as the first. In other words, in the fifth and sixth days of creation.
That he didn't intend.
So when he separated the dry land from the water on the second day of creation, he made a condition with the ocean to split when time comes.
Right.
When he finished his project on the sixth day, he made a condition with the ground to make an earthquake, to accommodate Korach, and for the mun to fall down in the desert. But when he created the animals, he didn't necessarily make a condition that at some point in time in history, they're going to have to gather together and destroy Egypt. Similarly, he didn't make some sort of compact with the lice to go ahead and infest the Egyptians' bodies for a week, or with darkness to rule for a week. So so the truth of darkness is that it may actually be eluded. Darkness may be a pre-planned miracle. It's not the typical understanding is that it isn't. Darkness and light were separated on the first day of creation, and later on God decided to punish the Egyptians with darkness. There was no there was no pre-planned agreement that at some point in the future things would be different. So therefore, in a certain sense, the miracles of the Exodus are greater miracles because they are a star example of divine interventionism, where God sees something in the world and changes it temporarily and makes a miracle. Unlike the miracle of Kriyas Yamsuf, which was what we'll call a natural miracle. It was a pre-planned miracle, which in a certain sense is less miraculous. It's sort of, we think that the water is not supposed to split. The truth of the matter is the water is supposed to split at one point in time, because that's how God designed the natural effect of water. On the other hand, like we spoke about last week, the Ramban says the purpose of miracles is to reveal that God runs the project, that this world is God's project and he takes care of the project. So therefore, what's the poster child for a disruptive, very evident miracle to an individual, a random person? Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea. Highly disruptive event, totally implausible, completely, Medrash says that all the water in the world splits. It wasn't just by the ocean. So in that sense, it was a greater miracle. The splitting of the sea was a greater miracle because it's more of a obvious sign that God runs the world. The miracles of the plagues, some people saw them, some people didn't see them, some people heard about them, but you can come to some sort of argument that some of them are not terribly beyond natural possibilities. You have a bunch of animals wreaking havoc. Maybe the zoo was untied for the night. Somebody forgot to lock it, and all the animals came out. And the lice. There are times and periods where lice are more common. So in a certain sense, the greatest sign that there's a God and a creator who runs the world is Kriyas Yamsuf. And that's to an individual, on an individual level. When a person recognizes the miracle of Kriyas Yamsuf, of splitting of the sea, he recognizes that God is everywhere. So that, I think, is a way to balance and understand two aspects of which is a greater miracle. The Exodus is a greater miracle because it was an interventionist miracle, because God intervened in the world. And the splitting of the sea is a greater miracle because to us regular people that don't know what exactly God planned, it looks much more startling. It looks like it's clearly a creator who's behind the project. But there's another aspect also to splitting the sea. Since the natural cause was that the sea would split for a certain period of time, when the Jewish people walked through the ocean, what happened? God turns to Moshe and says, put your hand over the water and the water will come back and drown the Egyptians. Now, hold on a second. The natural order is that the sea should come back to itself. It's a miracle that people could walk through the ocean. But because this miracle was pre-planned, it took another miracle to knock it back together, to take two sides of the ocean and put it back into one, because there was a predetermined agreement here that the water would split. It took a miracle to bring it back to what it was supposed to be. And in a certain sense, this is an interventionist miracle, right? God here planned the split, but now he's intervening and putting it back together again. Putting it back to what we call the natural, cause and effect. So in a certain sense, the splitting of the sea was the greatest sign, a miracle that was a pre-planned miracle. The return of the oceans is an interventionist miracle. When Hannah prayed for a child, so in her prayer, she said, Ein sur kelikeno, there's no rock like God's. What does that mean? So the Gemara explains, Ein tzair kelikeno, there's no sculptor as good as God. Because if you have a sculptor, he makes this beautiful sculpture, but it's inanimate, it's a rock, it's a piece of metal. But when God sculpts something, he can breathe life into it and animate it. The Baal Shem Tov has an interesting take on this. He's the founder of Hasidus. He explains this as follows. He says there was once a muralist, a world-famous muralist. He was known for his lifelike portrayals. And he embarked on a project to paint a full-size impression, realistic impression of a horse in a field. So he went to a field that had a bunch of horses, and he sat there for days, and he sketched out the form of the horse, he sketched out the bones, and he drew the muscles and the lines. He put out the motion and the action that the horse was engaged in. Finally, he draws out the face and the demeanor of the face and the look. And it's time to sell it. It's finished. He brings it to the marketplace and he situates it as you might expect a horse in a field to be situated. And people walk by, and the artist is waiting for everyone to give their grand offers for his impressive, realistic art. And nobody looks at him. Everyone just keeps on walking. So he's thinking to himself, what's going on? And then he realizes it's so good that nobody realizes that it's a painting. It's a very simple solution. He takes like municipal orange paint, and he paints an orange line, a bright orange line across the painting. All of a sudden, everyone realizes this is like, wow, this is impressive. If not for the orange line, you'd think it was real. And he gets a good deal, and somebody buys the painting. Gets nice compensation. Says the Baal Shem Tov, he says, this is the world. The world we live in, it's a real life painting. It looks so real that we forget about who's behind it. There's a sculptor standing next to the painting, and everyone ignores him because the world looks so real, looks like it is. So what did Hashem do? He needed a solution. So he took some orange paint and he painted a line through the painting. What does this mean? It means Kriyas Yam Suf. It means God split the sea. When God split the sea, he made such a startling appearance that it's just impossible to conclude that the natural order of a horse in the field would have an orange line through it. Obviously not. It was so impossibly illogical that everyone concluded, hold on, there's a sculptor standing right here. There's a God that's running the project. And therefore, everyone recognized the greatness of God and his involvement in day-to-day activity. Okay, so now let's try to put it all together. The Talmud says there is a Zug Rishon and a Zug Sheni, a first pair and a second pair. Perhaps it could be explained as follows. The first pair is a person's soulmate. Person's born as a fetus. God chooses a soulmate for him. That's planned. But then they live separately for 20 years or longer, or whatever it may be. And now they've each lived different lives. They each have a different set of actions, of deeds, of righteousness or otherwise. And now it's God's job to bring them back together. Zug Sheni, the second pair, is actually marrying them together now. And this involves often where once different spouses could be different places in their relationship, in God's planned pathway for them. Some of them maybe took God's word very seriously, others didn't. Some of them perhaps behaved exceeded God's expectations, while others met or worse, met God's expectations. And now Hashem has to find them and put them together. And that's the difficulty. So I'll explain as follows. The analog it makes a lot of sense now. The analog is as follows. The splitting of the sea is the natural predetermined miracle. It was a miracle that was predetermined before God created the ocean. So before God creates the ocean, he decides the ocean has to split. And it's like that before a person is born. God decides who his soulmate is. And then he takes one and he splits it into two. And people go out in the world and live their own lives. And now is the interventionist part, where God has to intervene and arrange for them to be brought together to meet each other. And that bringing together people that are far apart, distant, that involves very often bechi shiras, where you have these, everyone who gets married knows there's some sort of miraculous occurrence of how they met. There's always that stripe in the painting, where it's always clear that it was meant to be. At some point in the relationship, at some point of the pathway of how they met, there was some sort of orange line through the painting where it's clear that somebody's arranging this to happen. And that arrangement often involves difficulty for one side, not necessarily in the actual dating or courtship, but in getting to that stage. And therefore, Vayashuvu Hamayim, the comparison to splitting the sea is when God puts the sea back together again. And he intervenes in nature to arrange it so that these two people should meet each other, their courtship should be arranged in this way, and they should propose to each other and get married. And it's that, and when a person experiences that, he witnesses that reality of Hashem's orange stripe through his painting. He realizes how much Hashem worked to arrange all the pieces to get them back together, and what a challenge it is for that to happen. I want to finish with a very interesting story. This has been making its rounds across social media. The story of a Sephardi rabbi. His name was Rabbi Chaim Zayed. He said he was walking down the street one day and he hears a commotion coming from underneath a bus. So he goes over to some young man who comes out of the, who's next to the bus. This is a, coach bus with a, he's taking his luggage out of the luggage compartment underneath the bus. And he says to the guy, he says, "Is everything okay?" He says, yeah, don't worry about it. This is the problem. That girl over there, she's the problem. So what's going on? So he goes over to that girl. So she recognizes him. She goes to a certain seminary. He speaks in that seminary. So she says, what's going on? So she says, "No, don't ask, Rabbi, it's crazy." So the rabbi teaches in that school. So he says, tell me what happened? Maybe I could help you. He says, "Rabbi, it's just a mess." He says, "You don't understand." He says, I took the bus to go shopping. I was getting off the bus. I asked the driver to open the luggage compartment. Now in America, the luggage compartment is all manually actuated. In Israel, it's all controlled by the driver. So it's electrically controlled. So I asked the driver to open up the baggage compartment. So I'm pulling out my bag. And all of a sudden, I slipped and the bag goes deeper inside the luggage compartment. So I hopped on top of inside the luggage compartment and stretched out my hand to pull out the bag. And at that moment, the driver closes the luggage compartment. And I'm stuck inside. Dark. It's dark. Couldn't see a thing. It's hot. It's suffocating. And I started screaming. I said, "Driver, stop the bus." The driver's not going to hear her. It's a big diesel engine. The driver just keeps on driving. She's there. It's dark. Poor woman. Bus starts shaking. She's rolling back and forth, luggage all over her. She's screaming, "Driver, stop the bus." All of a sudden, he says, "Rabbi, you'll never believe this. There's another guy there underneath the bus." And all of a sudden, the guy starts yelling at me. He says, "What are you doing here? It's yichud. We're both single. We have no relationship with each other. We can't be together here. Nobody else is around. It's yichud." So she says to him, she screams at him. She says, "Lunatic. I can't breathe. It's dark. I'm stuck underneath the bus. Stop screaming at me about yichud." He says, "Yichud, get out of here. It's yichud." She says, "Quiet. I can't deal with you. I'm suffocating here." He says, "Yichud," screaming at her, "Yichud." Finally, the bus gets to the next stop. He opens the luggage compartment. And we both got out. So the rabbi says to the girl, he says, "Which guy is this?" She says, "That guy you were just talking to." So he goes over to the guy. He says, "Are you normal?" He says, "You have a poor girl. She's stuck underneath the bus. She can't breathe. She's suffocating, and you're screaming at her. You should sit down with her. Maybe start opening up people's bags, looking what's inside. Talk to her about your experiences. Well, what are you screaming at her for?" So he says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Yichud." The rabbi says, "It's not yichud. It's a first date." So the guy says, "What do you mean it's a first date?" "It's yichud." He says, No, it's a first date. "Can I have your contact information?" So he gives him his contact information. So he goes back to the girl and he says, "I want your contact information." She says, "What do you want?" He says, "That lunatic is going to be your husband." She says, "What?" It's okay. He gives her contact information. Today they're married. What's the lesson? She was underneath the bus. What's she thinking? God, why'd you do this to me? What am I doing here? I can't breathe. It's dark. I'm rolling back and forth. Why do you have to do this to me? She didn't realize that over there, she was going to find her husband. She recognized the orange stripe on the painting, that everything that Hashem does, it's planned. He's always there. He's doing everything. Sometimes you need a moment like that to recognize it.